Hello everybody, this is a video that will talk you through the first poem in our conflict anthology, and that poem is The Charge of the Light Brigade by Alfred Lord Tennyson. We have 15 poems to do, and as I said, this is our first one. And what I'd like you to do with this PowerPoint is to make your way through it over a number of sessions. So if you think about 3 sessions, that will give you time to look carefully at the language, to make notes about how the language is being used and the effects that are produced. And when you're making those notes, folks, I want you to focus on 5 essential elements, but we'll get to that as we go. So the first thing to point out is the picture that I've used, and this is a picture of what an artist imagined the charge of the Light Brigade would look like. Obviously, we have no real images of the charge of the Light Brigade because you've done your historical context research, so you know that we're talking about a military action in the 1850s. So this is an artistic impression of that charge. One of the things that we have to remember when we are doing this section in our GCSE English Literature exam is that we have 4 assessment objectives. Assessment objective 1, AO1, is that we have to understand the question and that we have to produce an argument that's based on that question, and that we have to write using appropriate English and paying attention to our spelling and our grammar and our punctuation. The second assessment objective is AO2, and that's our understanding of language and poetic techniques. So we have to understand that particular techniques are employed, and we have to work out how those techniques have an effect upon you as a reader. We have to make sure that effect can then be related to the question that's been asked. Assessment objective 3 is that we have to make links between 2 poems. So whenever we do this question, we will be comparing one poem with another poem from the anthology that has a similar topic. They're all going to be based on conflict, but by topic I mean that perhaps it's thinking about the effects of conflict, or the attitudes to conflict, or the results of conflict, or the victims of conflict. So you will be given the one poem in a question. You will be given the topic of the question, so compare and contrast how the poets have focused on the effects of conflict, and then you have to pick another poem that can be linked to that key part of the question, the effects of conflict, and you compare and contrast the 2 poems as you go through. So that's AO3, but we'll talk more about that as we build up our knowledge of the poems. There's no point talking about that when we only know one poem. And then the last AO is AO4, which relates to this and the work that you've done previously. So AO4 is about context, and that's historical and biographical context. So therefore we need to know a little bit about what was happening in the world of the poem, and also we need to know a little bit about the poet, but only when it's relevant to the question. There's no point you telling the examiner that Alfred Lord Tennyson was born in Somersby, England in 1809 if that doesn't relate in any way to the effects of conflict. So what I want you to do is to read through the information here on Alfred Lord Tennyson, and as it says in the speech bubble, not everything about him is important. So I need you to read through and find out information that you think might be relevant to a poem about war, and specifically this poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. Take your time to do that, but really what we're thinking about here, folks, will be about 3 things, no more than that. That we can take from this particular AO4 slide, concentrating on biographical content. Biographical context. So take your time to read through it and maybe highlight 3 things that you think might be important. Okay folks, if I were highlighting a few things here, the things that perhaps I would highlight would be 1, that he was the Poet Laureate. And the Poet Laureate means that he has been appointed by the Queen, by the government, to be the official poet of the nation, and therefore it's his responsibility to write poems that reflect the nation and its times. So as Poet Laureate, he then chose to focus on poems that were perhaps a bit more political. And the Charge of the Light Brigade is political in that they're talking about a very serious event in a war that affects Great Britain. And what they're doing with, or what he's doing with that event, is he's trying to create a particular interpretation, a particular narrative around that. And that narrative is mainly supportive of the soldiers and their officers and the bravery that they showed at a moment of crisis. I think it's important that we bear that in mind, because for many people the Charge of the Light Brigade was a completely unmitigated disaster, but that's not what he portrays it as. He focuses on the honour and the bravery of the men. And then the last thing I think I maybe would highlight here is that he chose to write as a poet laureate in a more narrative style. And you will find that as we go through the poem that the style is more narrative. It's telling the story of that particular momentous moment in the Crimean War. Right, let's get going. One thing I wanted to do was just give you a bit of an understanding about how the Crimean War had an effect upon subsequent wars. And one way in which it did that was because of this guy here, William Howard Russell. So he was a journalist working in England, but he was an Irishman. And what he became was the very first war correspondent. So when we think about wars and our knowledge of wars, if we think about what has been happening in Syria, if we think about what has happened in the Yemen, if you think perhaps of how we have had information on wars broadcast to us nightly through the BBC and other news channels, and that information is broadcast because reporters have been on the scene, they have found information, and they are putting themselves perhaps on the front lines and in dangerous situations to find information out and to broadcast that information to other people in other countries. And that's the job of a war correspondent. And the Crimean War was the first war where that particular profession came to the fore. And here we have William Howard Russell, and that was his job. So quite a lot of the correspondence in relation to the Crimean War was relayed back to England because of the work of men like William Howard Russell. And if you think about war correspondents whose names perhaps sound familiar to you today, all of them owe a debt of gratitude to the work that this man did. Now, the Crimean War, you don't really need to know much about it at all. All we need to remember is that it is a war that's being fought between Britain and Russia. The dates of the war there are important, folks, as well. Again, that's another little bit of AO4, that's another little bit of contextual information. But if you wish, you can find out a little bit more information, and the work that I set you to do and the videos that I asked you to watch were focused on the Crimean War itself. So I'm not really going to go into it in any great detail, but I do want you to remember that when we're writing about this poem, we would use that historical information that the Crimean War was fought between Britain and Russia. It did last from 1853 to 1856. You might want to know a couple of things, such as over 150 people were killed and 120 were wounded in the Battle of the Light Brigade. So you might want to point that out. Sorry, the Battle of Balaclava that involved the Charge of the Light Brigade. That's perhaps a better way of phrasing it. And if you have a little look at it, you've got the idea that the nation, the British nation that was informed of this moment of heroism, the nation itself mourned the unnecessary loss of life, and therefore it was the work of war correspondents that allowed that information to come through to the British nation and for them to understand what was happening hundreds of miles away. I think this is a little interesting bit of history here. This is the actual report that was sent through and published in the Times, focusing on the Charge of the Light Brigade. And I'd like you to spend a little bit of time to read through it and see what key phrases maybe stand out to you. You don't really need to know any of this information. I don't think there's anything really there that you want to take with you. But as you read through it, you can see how that politicalization of the event has already been established. So, for example, calling it a grand military holocaust, that idea that even though it was completely inept and these men died for no good reason, we don't have critical voices saying, what are these officers doing? Instead, we have the British public being fed a narrative that is focusing on the honour and the bravery of these men and not on the incompetence of those people who put them in this situation in the first place. You can imagine that this story, this particular report, would be very different if it were talking about events in 2020 rather than events that took place so long ago. Now, as with all things, before you start to look at a text, I think it's really important that you work out the Pac-Man in your own mind, because that will allow you to understand how particular messages are being brought to the fore. So this is just a good way for you to get to approaching any text. Try in your mind to work out what the purpose and the audience and the context of the text was or is before you begin your analysis of it. So, as I've said here, the purpose of this particular poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson was to eulogise and glorify the courage of the Light Brigade. And to eulogise means to speak about someone or something that has been lost in a way that is respectful and a way that is reverential, bringing to mind the idea that this person or this thing is worthy of praise even though they have been lost. So we have there this focus on the praise and the glory that should be associated with a courageous act, and this courageous act is the charge of the Light Brigade. The audience is the British public, and the poem was printed in a newspaper called The Examiner. So we have the idea that it was always written for the British public to understand how monumental this particular moment was in the battle, because not because of the result in terms of what happened in the battle, but because it was a way to understand the courage and the bravery of those men who fought despite the overwhelming odds against them and despite the fatalistic the fatalistic results. They were not in any way, shape or form cowed by that. Instead, they had a duty and they rose and they enacted that duty. And then the context, it was published 6 weeks after the battle while the war continued. So it's fresh. It's when it was published, it was fresh and it was relevant. And what it was trying to do was trying to give shape and meaning to a nation that was mourning already. So in amongst the grief and the sense of loss that they had been defeated in such a way, then the nation could understand that there was a great hope and a great sense of pride to be taken in the idea that these men were British men and that they had courage that will live on forever, even though they were defeated. Okay, so what I wanted to do here was just give you an understanding of how we are going to approach these poems and how you should approach your note making. So when it comes to poetry, what we're trying to do is focus on 5 specific ways of looking at a poem and 5 specific ways of understanding how the poem is created. So what we want to do is we want to look at the form of each poem. What particular shape does it take? Does it perhaps reflect a poetic form that is known? So is it a sonnet? Is it a ballad? Is it a narrative poem, as this one is? Then, of course, we're going to look at the biggie, the use of language. Language is our main driver because that's how the meaning is being communicated to you. So we're going to look at how the poet has used language and the effect of the language techniques that have been used. And then hand in hand with that, we've got imagery, because those two things go together. Don't know why I'm drawing this. It looks a bit like a weird, creepy snowman. But anyway, there you go. So language and imagery, they are our main drivers. Those are the things that we should focus on mostly, because those are the things that we can relate to the question, to the AO1, the effects of conflict, attitudes towards conflict, victims of conflict. Language and imagery are going to be our main tools when we're trying to develop an essay. Rhythm and rhyme, they're going to be important because we're focusing on poetry. However, knowing the rhythm, knowing the rhyme is not going to be relevant unless we can relate it to the question. So with form, rhythm and rhyme, they're important. They will be informative, but the main drivers are still going to be language and imagery. And then finally, tone. Now, our tone and the tonal changes, they will all be as a result of language and imagery. So tone will go hand in hand with language and imagery. So when we're trying to make our notes, and when you're making your notes, what you want to try and do is create a grid that focuses on what's important about the form of this poem. What are the main important things I need to know about language and how it's been used, about imagery and how it's been used? What do I need to know about the rhythm and the rhyme of this poem? And what do I need to know about the tone and the tonal changes within the poem? And at the end of this PowerPoint, I'll talk you through how you should make your notes on that. Okay. Now, I had asked you to watch the video of a reading of the poem, and I really hope that you have done that. So I'm not going to read the poem through for you now. Hopefully you've watched a reading of the poem and you read it for yourself, read it out loud. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through an analysis of the poem. So I'm going to skip through and we'll talk then about what's important in each stanza. So folks, let's look at stanza 1, and let's start off by looking at the form. Immediately, folks, we are immersed into the event. So we don't have any information saying, oh, the charge of the Light Brigade was part of a battle in relation to the Crimean War and it was linked to the Battle of Balaclava. We don't have any of that extraneous detail. Immediately the poem begins at a moment of action, and that makes what's going to happen immediate and unstoppable, and it really focuses the reader's mind on the idea that we are part of that action with them. So it heightens the impact on the reader who would understand the tragedy that is to come. Remember, a 19th century reader would be well aware of the defeat that was the result of the charge of the Light Brigade, but that's not at issue here. What's at issue is that the form immediately takes us to a moment of action, and we share in that moment of action. The tone of that opening stanza is important as well. It's obviously tense because we're at a moment of action, and there is a sense that this is an ominous moment, because remember, the tragedy would be well known. Everybody knows how this is going to end. Obviously the people who are taking part in that moment, as fictionalized here by Alfred Lord Tennyson, well, they don't know how it's going to end, but you, the reader, will. So the key thing here in relation to tone is that the tone is tense and ominous. There's a sense of apprehension, but there's also a sense that everyone involved in stanza 1 is determinedly moving forward, moving towards what is tense, moving towards the threat. So even though there is a sense of apprehension, there isn't a sense of fear. People are moving towards it. The language and the imagery work together to allow you, the reader, to understand how that tension and fear is developing. So let's look at the language. The most notable thing is the use of repetition, and you've got that repetition in the phrase half a league, half a league, half a league. So we have that use of repetition. And why is that use of repetition important? Well, what it does is it shows you the constant movement forward to face the foe. So even though there's a sense of threat and trepidation and apprehension, there isn't a sense of reluctance. Instead, what we have is this movement forwards. And the movement forwards is of a body of men, the 600. So it's not 600 men, but it's the 600, one collective identity, one body, one force moving forward. And that creates a great degree of strength. This is a collective effort, and it's a British collective effort. So we're really focusing on how patriotic this poem is. And again, as a poet laureate, that's the job of Alfred Lord Tennyson, to create poems that are patriotic, that will inspire the British people to have a sense of who they are and the greatness that they represent. We've got imagery then as well, and specific imagery that perhaps is something that you may have picked up on. So what we have first of all is the use of an allusion. So an allusion is a reference to another text, and in this case it's a reference to the Bible, a biblical verse. So the Valley of Death is an allusion from the Bible to Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I will fear no evil. So by taking that biblical allusion and applying it to this particular situation in the Battle of Balaclava, what Alfred Lord Tennyson is doing is he is using that biblical allusion to imply that the graciousness and godliness of that particular phrase, the valley of death, and I shall fear no evil, the graciousness and the righteousness and the godliness of that, which was applicable to the Bible, is also applicable to these men. They have God on their side. They're focusing on doing what is right. So even though what they're doing is deadly, it is also the right thing to do. So by making that allusion to the valley of death, what Tennyson is doing here is he's associating this collective effort of 600 men with the right thing to do, that they have God on their side, that what they're doing is something that's monumental, but it's something that's righteous. Following on then, in the first stanza, let's have a look at how the direct speech changes things a little bit. So you have the direct speech, and again, direct speech is an AO2 technique that you can comment on, and what that does is, again, it brings us to the very moment. Again, it gives us this idea that we are there at the moment when the events are occurring, so it creates this sense of immediacy, that we're sharing in that fateful moment. And even though the fateful moment is one that we know will end tragically, there is a real sense of empowerment in that this is a decision that people take and that they choose to act upon. So the use of imperatives, again, another language technique there, the use of imperatives will let you understand as a reader that this action is unquestionably accepted, that these are men who are focused, who choose to accept the discipline of an army life, and that they trust their officers to ensure that what they're doing is the right thing. Now, remember that in 2020, there would not be perhaps this absolute understanding that the trust between the officers and men is indisputable. Having an understanding of what occurred at the Battle of the the Charge of the Light Brigade linked to the Battle of Balaclava, if this were a modern day situation, there would be investigations, there would be recriminations, there would be criticism, but we don't have any of that within this poem, because that's not what Alfred Lord Tennyson has tried to do in this poem. What he's doing is he's trying to celebrate the honour. He's not being critical of the mistakes that led to these deaths. So the use of the direct speech, it changes the tone. It makes the tone one that is focused on exhorting the men to act. And exhortation is a military call to action, and that's what you have here in the first stanza. The imagery being used in the first stanza is again a repetition of that imagery of the valley of death. We've talked about that and how it creates this ominous mood, but what it also does is let you know that this is an action that cannot be stopped. It's irrevocable. Nothing can stop this now. And even though we know how it's going to end, these men are decisive in their action. Because it's irrevocable, because we know how it's going to end tragically, that creates a poignant mood. We know that these men are choosing to ride into their death. But also we have an idea that the mood is patriotic, and we've got a balance between the poignant and the patriotic, because the poem is emphasising the decision to act, to enter a valley knowing the danger, and therefore what the poem is doing, it's celebrating these bold and brave actions of the 600. Again, that idea of the men as a collective. The form of the poem, you've got short lines focused on actions, following on from the orders of the officer. You've got to focus also on that preposition into, suggests that the men choose to make the decision to move into danger. So their decision is immediate, it's unthinking, it's an instinctive response of the men to act. So they are accepting the danger, and that is a brave thing. Now, you could be thinking, is this blind acceptance? What would happen if they chose not to? And again, those questions are perhaps a more modern interpretation of events. But within this poem, what we have is a real focus on trying to venerate the actions of men for the honour and the courage that not questioning the strategies that were employed. When it comes to the rhythm here, what we have is we have a rhythm that goes dum da da, dum da da. So you've got that real strength on the dum on the first syllable, and then da da. So 600. And what we have is a particular rhythm that's called a falling rhythm. Now we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but remember, when we're talking about rhythm and rhyme, we'll only make reference to it when we can link it clearly to the focus of the question. So stanza 2, forward the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Okay, let's have a look at that. Again, with the tone, we have this real sense of patriotism, and that is again referenced through the direct speech and the exhortation that opens the verse. Emphasis is played then on the determination of everybody to do their duty. Within the language then, you've got the rhetorical question. And that rhetorical question is important because what it allows you to do is it allows you to focus on how patriotic this poem is. And there's an involvement between the reader and the total acceptance and commitment of the men, that we as a reader think about the total commitment of the men at this moment. And because you as a reader are being provoked to think about the total commitment of the men through the rhetorical question, what that should do is it should trigger off in your thought, particularly if you were a British person at the time reading this poem, a tremendous sense of pride in your compatriots, in your fellow Englishmen, British soldiers, whatever way they would have chosen to think of it at the time. You have then a direct understatement in that idea that someone had blundered. Now, when you think about a blunder usually means a careless mistake. Oh, so you've spilt water over a desk. Well, that's a blunder. But when you're thinking about a mistake that results in the death of 150 men and the wounding of over 100 men, that's more than a blunder. That's more than a blunder. So what we have is an understanding of why would this catastrophic mistake be described in such a simple way. And the word that I've chosen to use here is innocuous. Innocuous is a word that means that something is harmless. Now you know that this mistake was not harmless. You know that it was fatalistic. It was a tragedy. But by describing it as a blunder makes it seem harmless. And what the poet is doing here is he's using a particular technique which is called litotes, which means deliberate understatement. So instead of saying this, someone had made a catastrophic mistake, he says somebody had blundered. So why does he use litotes? Why does he use deliberate understatement to talk about such a fatal error? And the purpose is, this poem is not focused on the fatal error. This poem is focused on the courage of the men. And therefore, what he's doing is underplaying what is a pretty serious political question, and instead making sure that in the forefront of this poem you have the courage and the bravery of the men. So the narrative he is telling in this poem is one that focuses on the courage and bravery of the men and not on the ineptitude of those who were being paid to strategize and ensure that this battle was going to be an effective one. You've also got, in relation to form, how the lines are structured, and you've got this structure of having the word not placed at the start of lines. Now, the most important placing within lines is usually at the very start or the very end. So when you're looking at a line, try to look at what word is at the start or what word is at the end. And at the start of the lines here, we have the word not. And we have not being used to give us the idea that no one questioned what was going to happen. So by placing of the word not at the start of the next line, it's suggestive of answering the question that has been asked. So was anybody dismayed? No, they weren't. They weren't dismayed. So by having that use of a question being asked and an answer following it, then what we have is the idea of another technique being used here, which is called Hypophora. So the Hypophora, what it does is it answers the question that's been asked, and it says that not one was dismayed. So no, not one was dismayed. The not actually belongs to the phrase that someone had blundered, but what we have is an understanding that no one was dismayed. The structure of the stanza diminishes, like the litotes did before, the emphasis on the blunder, and instead what it does is it focuses on the duty of the men. So what we have here is Tennyson using language to focus on what he thinks is the purpose of this poem, which is to celebrate the bravery of the men and not to focus on the ineptitude of the officers. We also have the idea that this poem is really carefully constructed to give the nation what they need. So at a time of crisis, when the war is ongoing, when the British have been defeated at this moment in the Battle of Balaclava, what the population need is they need something to be proud of. And in this poem, he gives them the sacrifice of the men to be proud of. So the purpose is to valorize or to respect or to have pride in the courage of the soldiers. And remember, as it said in the news report from the Times, it said that this would perhaps, the Battle of the Balaclava would afford the subject of painful but vain recrimination. So people later will look at what happened and try to work out why such ineptitude was allowed to happen. But at this moment in time, what Tennyson is doing is not focusing on that, but using Hypophora and using litotes and using a patriarchal tone, not a patriarchal tone, the patriotism of the tone, to allow the reader to have a sense of pride in the courage of these men. Now, the repetition of "there's not" is really important, and those lines themselves have had a life beyond this poem. And what we have here are two things being used in terms of language. The first thing is repetition, and the second thing is anaphora. Anaphora is the repetition of a key phrase at the start of lines. And so what we have here is we have anaphoric repetition, i.e. we've got that use of anaphora, there's not, there's not, there's not. And again, it gives you the idea that they are working as a collective. This is a collective working together. So it's not a group, it's not individual men, but it's a group of men working and empowered by each other's collective spirit. So they're working with one force, one power, one strength. That these men are united in their idea of what is their duty. They're patriotic and they're idealistic. They will do the right thing. And those lines, "there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die," they have become lines that people say when they're not even referring to this poem. They've become part of our speech. So they're idiomatic. They're lines that have their own meaning now, and the meaning that they have now is one about strength and about duty and about courage, even at times of crisis. You've also got some oral imagery, which means that you've got a sound that's having a particular effect on you. And here it's the do and die. These really heavy D sounds, do and die. So the repetition of the D sounds, and also the fact that these verbs are monosyllabic, do and die. What they do is they create this sense of reverberation and echoing. You'll remember that line, theirs but to do and die. And again, it places the emphasis on the unquestioning self-sacrifice of these soldiers. They choose to do their duty and their honour, even placing their own lives below the abstract concepts of duty and honour. The tone here is glorification of that self-sacrifice and a real sense of deference, that these men know their place, that they know that they are soldiers and it is their place to put their life on their line for their queen and country. So they have an understanding of a hierarchy. They understand that queen and country come before their own lives, and they're willing to risk their lives for it. You've got the repeated phrase of into the valley of death rode the 600, and we've talked about the importance of into and valley of death and 600, so I'll not really go into that anymore. But what we have also is a narrative poem that's sharing the characteristics of other narrative poems or other ballads, because it's a very romanticised version of history. This is an act that was calamitous, it resulted in disaster, but here we have a very romanticised version of that. There's no cynicism, there's no scorn, there's no righteous indignation that these men are just being sent to their deaths. All of these things you would expect if this poem were to be rewritten for 2020, but not in the 1850s. Is this poem very much a product of its time? The answer there is yes, very much so. And then finally, if we look at the rhyme, you've got the simple full end rhyme of reply, why and die. And the effects of that simple full end rhyme. Well, one, it helps quicken the pace. Remember that we've got the sense of we're there in the middle of the action and we're moving forward. So that quickening of pace reflects that idea of this movement forward and the caught in the middle of the action. It also has a simplicity to it which reflects the simplicity of the soldiers' acceptance. They're there to do their duty. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's what they will do. They will focus on what is the right thing for them to do. And again, it links to this word deference that I've talked about before. And deference is when you know your place. You know that there are people above you who deserve respect. And therefore what we have is that these soldiers know that the officers and the sergeants are before them, and that before them is their duty to government and to the Queen and to the idea of serving the British Empire. And therefore these men know their place, and they know that their place is to put their lives on the line to serve others and to honour their Queen and their country. And that's what they do in a very deferential way. Then we get to the third stanza. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Right, so again we have that use of anaphora or anaphora, where you've got the repetition of a key phrase, and the repetition here is of cannon to. So we're immediately in the midst of battle. We're there with them. And the repetition makes the reader understand that you, with the soldiers, that you're both surrounded. We've got men against machines, and who's going to win? The machines. There's nothing that the men can do with the cannon to the left of them, cannon to the right of them. So we have a real sense here through the use of anaphora how in the midst of battle the men are surrounded, that it's man against these mechanised means of war and the machines in the war, the mechanised means of war, that will ultimately be disastrous to the men who are surrounded. You've got imagery again, oral imagery with, you've got sibilants, repeated S sounds of stormed at with shot and shell, and these S sounds are short and they're sharp, and again emphasizing the danger of the shrapnel and the weaponry that surrounds the men. So those short, sharp S sounds emphasize the danger of the situation. You've also got lots of monosyllabic words that help create pace as well, at, with, shot and shell, and one syllable words help develop the pace and the momentum of a line, and what you have here is the pace increasing, allowing you to understand the frenzied fury of battle. You've got personification being used with the jaws of death and the mouth of hell, and therefore we have an idea that these men are being caught in a moment of action that can only ever result in one fatal outcome. So death itself is their enemy, as well as the Russians, because you've got the jaws of death awaiting them, you've got the mouth of hell in front of them. So what you have here are words linked to a semantic field associated with death and hell and shot. All of these words allowing you to understand that death surrounds these men. The extended metaphor of the mouth suggests that men are being devoured by battle, devoured by the weaponry, and there's only ever going to be one outcome, and you know that's not a good one. You also have then the form of the poem in terms of how the lines are written, and you've got the important use of syntax. Syntax is the structure of a line, so where words are placed within a line. And we said on the previous slide that the first word and the last word are often the most important. And here the word boldly is placed at the start of the line, so it focuses on the soldier's actions. So despite the terror of the jaws of death that are awaiting them and the mouth of hell that stands open for them, despite all of that danger, the men act boldly. They're not cowed by this experience, they're courageous. They're undeterred by the danger and the ferocity of the violence, and they move forward. Again, we've got that idea of pace building and this rapid movement forward. No hesitancy, no fear, nobody shying away from their duty, everybody moving forward. And that collective spirit is again repeated through the phrase, rode the 600. So the tone here, folks, is focusing on the idea of the battle, and the tone balances between the fatalism of the action, we know how it's going to result, but also the reverence of the speaker, the reverence of the poet, who is valorizing, who is placing on a pedestal the courage of the men and their determination to move forward into danger. Okay, now let's look at a little bit at the rhythm and rhyme. So again, I want to look at the rhyme, the full end rhyme. We've said before, what does that do? It quickens the pace. It shows us the movement of these men. So again, it's simplistic. They accept their duty, and it quickens their pace. Now, the next little bit about rhythm is perhaps a bit too detailed, and we don't necessarily need to go into it there in so much detail, but what we do have is an idea of how the stresses on the syllables in the words, two stressed syllables of volleyed, thundered, how those stressed syllables are perhaps giving us an understanding of the frenzy of battle, of how this is a place where the machinery of war is heard and reverberating within this valley. So the key things that we want to get here, folks, are the idea of how the battle is being recreated. We have this idea of the soldiers being surrounded, and yet in amongst that, the bravery and courage of these men as they determinedly move forward. Okay, if we look at the fourth stanza now. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Language is really important in this fourth stanza, because what we have is a focus on verbs. verbs that are driving the action of the battle. So what we have here are the soldiers as action men, that the soldiers are working with their sabres, that their sabres are battling against heavy artillery. So a sabre is a sword and it's battling a cannon, and yet they continue. So what we have is an obvious David versus Goliath effort. So if you had a sword and somebody else had a cannon, I think you'd understand that somebody else has a better chance of winning. Yet here we have men with sabres facing cannon, and they continue. They continue to fight and they continue to charge. So by focusing on the verbs, we've a real sense of how these men are undeterred by the understanding that they're outgunned, that they're outnumbered. We've got the verbs used here in the present participles, in that they're sabering and charging. So it's not sabered and charged, but it's sabering and charging. So they're still doing it. It gives you this idea that by using the present tense, we've got this idea that we are in the action, and the action is taking place all around us. So it's not something that belongs to the past, but that's something that is happening now. And again, it develops that immediacy of the action. The fight is happening right in front of the speaker, in the reader. And again, it gives us the idea that the action is something we are immersed in. There's a quickening of the pace, there's the replication of the action in the present tense, and what it does is it creates the excitement of that action. So the violence that we have depicted here is done in the present tense. It's done in a way that glamorizes that violence, because it makes you understand how heroic these soldiers are in the face of the opposition that they are surrounded by. You've got the use of proper nouns, Cossack and Russian, and it gives you the idea that these soldiers are being surrounded by global power. The global power of the Russian Empire is something that's bearing down upon them, and yet these men are able to shatter those representatives of global powers. So we have an understanding that this poem is definitely being written to create a very patriotic view of what happened at the Battle of Balaclava, that this is a monumental effort on that these soldiers are doing on behalf of the British Empire, that at this moment in time that they are the underdog. There are only 600 of them, and yet they're battling this global representation of power of Cossacks and Russians, and they're doing all of this despite the fact that they're surrounded by cannon. You've also got the long vowel sounds of the world wondered, and what that does is that again it valorizes or glamorizes the courage of the deed. It lengthens the line, it creates a moment of stillness. So in amongst all of this action, you've got a moment just to ponder the significance of what these men are doing, and the world will wonder at the glory of their bravery. So reference to the world as well, so not just Britain wonders at the glory of their bravery, that the world itself will do that. It gives this sense of global significance of what they're doing. A mere 600 men can have such a monumental moment of bravery, and that they can do that, and that the world will venerate them for it. It does remind me of the idea of the 300 Spartan soldiers at the Battle of Thermopylae, and that might be something that you're familiar with. You may have seen the film, but if not, don't you worry about that. If we look at the rhythm and rhyme, again you've got that full end rhyme, and you've got the enjambment, which means you've got one line running directly into the other line, turned in the air, sabering so the idea that the line doesn't end at the end of the line but continues on to the next. What it does is it quickens the pace also, and immerses us as readers into the frenzy of this battle. So the battle doesn't stop at the end of the line, but the line continues on just as the battle continues on. And again, we're sensationalizing the action. This is not a stanza written from the point of view of a pacifist. This is a stanza written from the point of view of a poet laureate who wants to venerate the memory of these brave soldiers. The imagery that we have within this stanza is important as well. It captures the frenzy of battle. So you have the idea of the battery smoke, and then you also have, again, we've got that use of sibilance, the sabre stroke shattered and sundered. So you've got those really harsh S sounds. That's something that we've had before. And what they're doing here is it gives you emphasis, place the emphasis on the destruction that's being unleashed. So you have that sharp S sound, the destruction that's been unleashed. You've got the idea that we have man fighting against machines, fighting against nations, and not being broken by that. Then you also have the tone. The tone, when we're focusing on the battle, the tone is one that is exciting and it's energized. So the action is thrilling. So if you think about all the movies that you've watched where they've got really long action sequences of people fighting hand-to-hand combat or people fighting with weaponry, that's done because people like to watch that. They find it exciting, they find it energizing. It's that vicarious thrill that you're experiencing secondhand. And what you have here is exactly the same thing. You just, as you would in an action movie, you've got a sequence that focuses on the fighting itself. So you've got patriotic pride, that the destruction that these men can unleash against the global enemies of the Cossack and of the Russian. You've got the idea that their courage is eulogized, their pluck, their courage, their determination. And you've got that reverential tone in the world wondered, that idea of how 600 men could unleash such a gargantuan effort against the cannon of the Cossack and everything that surrounds them. You've also then got a change in tone, and when you have a sudden change in tone, it's called a volta. So a volta is a sudden change in tone, and here you have a volta because you have a change from the exhilaration of the battle to the poignancy of the outcome, that not all 600 could ride back, that unfortunately what you have is that acceptance of loss. And therefore the volta marks a change, focusing not on the battle but on the consequences of the battle. And we don't immediately know how many did not ride back, and therefore you've got that anticipatory tone in the last line, because the true extent of the slaughter is not directly stated. We don't know how many were left in anticipation that we will find out. In terms of the rhythm, you have the idea that there is moments to pause. So you've got a caesura, which is a moment to pause within a stanza, and that pause allows you to think about the outcome of the courage. So this was a courageous act, no doubt, but the fatal outcome is something that we are given time to think about, and the caesura allows us to have that time. So go back and look and see where that caesura is and be guided by the colour code here, folks. And what it does is it creates a more poignant repetition of not. So not the 600 who left will ride back. How many have been lost, we don't know yet. Stanza 5 then, cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered, stormed out with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. So within this fifth stanza, we've got quite a few things that we've seen previously. So you've got the repetition of the description that we had in stanza 3, and all of the things that we said then are true now. So it emphasised the challenge that continues not just at within the battle that we had in stanza 4, but in the return return from that battle. So the fight to return is just as treacherous as the battle itself, and it gives you the understanding that there's no end to the danger that these men face, but also if there's no end to the danger that they face, there's no end to the courage that they've shown. Again, you've got the repetition of imagery and the personification of death with the metaphor of mouth of hell, and the things that we said in stanza 3 are just applicable here. But again, there's no respite from that danger. Even when the duty's done, even when they've fought as they should, they've still got the idea that they have to return home. So what we have is another attempt to make heroic but almost mythical levels of heroism here, mythical levels of courage shown by these men, because not only do they have to face these fears and these hideous situations once going into the battle, but they also have to face them again on their return. So they have to defy the odds not once but twice. And again, it is a monumental way to venerate the courage of these men. You've got the tone of repetition of left, and it gives us a link to that anticipatory tone that we had at the end of the last stanza, because as a reader it makes you nervous, it makes you feel uncomfortable and uncertain because you don't know how many of them are left. Again, the quantity is not made explicit, so the focus is not on the survivors, but on the collective body. Guys, sorry, I've made a mistake there, so maybe fix that. But it's on the collective body of these men returning. And then finally, when it comes to form, you've got the repetition of stormed at with shot and shell. This time it's not followed by the word boldly as it was previously. And what you have is the tragic tone of the stormed at by shot and shell, and then the contrast of the heroic death. So we have the idea of a more tragic tone being developed within this. And remember, the tragedy is that such courageous men have died, not that such courageous men were put into a situation that was one where they could not hope to win. In terms of form, you've got the syntax of the line really emphasizing that the hero fell, horse and hero fell, and it suggests really a stress placed on the glory achieved at the moment of death. So the horse and hero fell, these two brave souls operating as one have achieved this individual glory at the moment of death. It's made a bit more poignant by the fact that it's not heroes but heroes, so it gives you the idea that this collective body was made up of individual heroes. So by personalizing the act rather than looking at it collectively, it lets us know that this group of 600 that has always been seen as a collective spirit of bravery and courage was made up of individual men doing their duty. And then we get to stanza 6. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honour the charge they made, honour the light brigade, and no 600. So in stanza 6, folks, then you have a stanza that reflects on the events, not as a single battle, but as this epic endeavour that will be mythologized, and by that it means that it will live on forever. It will become the subject of myth. People will not believe how courageous and brave these men were. The glory doesn't really belong to just one moment in time, but it's something that the world will feel forever. So that glory just doesn't relate to how these soldiers fought at this particular battle, but actually the glory of these soldiers as something that the whole world will accept in a universal and in a timeless way. So it means that what they have done is something that is timeless. Their sacrifice takes upon it a timeless quality. The personal engagement which the rhetorical question creates makes it places the focus upon you as an individual reader to think about that, for the reader to be thoughtful and to think that you as the reader are responsible for maintaining the memory and the reverence of the Light Brigade, so that you must carry the torch and continue to think about their bravery. And again, that is something that this poem has done. The poem was written so very long ago, and yet it lives on. The glory of the Light Brigade has become something that's been mythologized, something that has been accepted as a huge and noble sacrifice. And that lives on way beyond the idea that somebody blundered, that it was a colossal and catastrophic mistake. Again, you have the repetition of this imperative honour, and that puts the duty upon you as a reader to honour these men and to keep them in your mind. So we've had direct speech before that was asking the Light Brigade to do their duty, and here you've got the idea that you're being asked to do your duty to honour these men. The onus is now placed upon the reader to act in a responsible way to venerate the memory of those people who acted with nobility and deference. So not for you as a reader to go, oh, why did they do that? Oh my gosh, I can't believe those particular officers were so inept. That's not what you're being asked to do. What you're being asked to do is revere the men and their acts, to see the nobility in what they did. The men are given this epithet, which is a name that's given to describe a person. And here you have the person or collective body of people. You've got the noble 600, and therefore you have an understanding that the public accepts this epithet is appropriate. They are noble. Their sacrifice was noble. And as a collective, they are noble. You've also got the tone. You've got a movement from solemnity to this of the honour to exhilaration, by what they did was so brave, was so beyond what could be expected of men, that you have a celebration of their wild charge, of their fighting spirit, of their plucky response, of the bravado of these men. So in amongst the solemnity of their loss, in amongst the great desire to honour their sacrifice, you also have the exhilaration of what bravery these men showed at a time of crisis. There's pride in their fearlessness as well as sorrow for their loss. So the attitude to the battle here is a mixed one. The battle itself is exhilarating. The bravery they showed is something that can be celebrated, and their loss is something that needs to be remembered with solemnity, and their bravery is something that needs to be remembered with a great degree of reverence. Then in the form of the stanza, it all comes down, the poem itself distills down to the form all comes down to one line, that last line. So everything reduces down to the idea of the noble 600. And what we have here is a repetition of that clear collective endeavour that these men have elevated their status beyond what would ever be thought of as necessary for a soldier. They have become part of the nation's memory. They've become part of the myth of the Great British Empire, in that they are part of what will always be remembered as the best and brightest thing about the British military. So the poem is really itself a linguistic war memorial. It's a way to create an epitaph for these men, an epitaph that's not carved onto a tombstone, but has been carved into the canon of English literature, because The Charge of the Light Brigade is a poem that lives on, and each time it does, what it does is it remembers the bright bravery of the Light Brigade. Their heroism is immortalised through this poem and through the reader's engagement with the poem. And hopefully that takes us to the end of our analysis of that particular poem. And now I'm going to tell you what you have to do with it. So folks, what I need you to do is go back through the poem and look at the 5 different topics that I introduced at the very start: form, language, imagery, rhythm and rhyme, and tone. And what you have to do is make notes on each section. Now, to help you for this particular poem, I've done that for you. So you can see here, I've put all of the blue form notes together. And again, taking you through the stanza, all of the form notes. I've done the same for language. And obviously there's a lot more on language. Language is one of the main drivers. And it takes you through each stanza. The second main driver there is imagery, and again I've gone through, taking us all the way to the end of the poem. Rhythm and rhyme, I've done that as well. Folks, I would ask you just to focus on what you think would be applicable to most questions. So if you look there at perhaps what I'm saying about rhyme and how rhyme links to pace. Also, if we look at keywords like caesura and enjambment, which are applicable for rhythm and rhyme as well. And finally then, the main points on tone, taking us all the way to the final stanza. So this is an example of what a flirt grid might look like, and it's entirely up to you how you choose to do this. There's no point you just copying out my notes into a flirt grid. You need to take from it what you understand, what you can make your own. So I don't mind anybody copying down things that I've written as long as you understand them. So you're not just transcribing things, but you're actually saying, okay, well, I understand what was happening there with the personification of death. So under imagery, I'm going to put personification of death, and I'm going to write down what was written in the notes because I understand that. There's no point you writing notes on rhythm and writing down dactyls and spondies if you don't understand what that means. And again, some of that stuff, folks, is just a little bit too detailed. I was giving you it, but I perhaps should have not given you it in such detail. So the key thing that you're doing here is you're taking from these notes what you understand, and you're making revision notes based on that. You can do it on a computer like I've done here, or you can do it on paper. I don't mind, but you do have to do it. That's the key thing. You do have to do it. And once you have these revision tables made for your poems, then when it actually comes to writing our essays where we have to focus on comparing and contrast, you will find that so much easier. So this is the first time you'll do this with a flirt grid. So you go through the poem, you go through my analysis of it, look at the notes that I've given you, and then from that you take what you understand and you fill in a grid. I really want you to remember that the parts of this grid that will be more detailed and longer than any others will be the language and the imagery part. So you're going to write more on language and more on imagery than on any of the other parts. When it comes to form, just think about, well, what's key, what you think is really important. When it comes to rhythm and a rhyme, again, just think about what do you think will be really important. So I'm probably going to mention the full rhyme there and the impact of it. I'm probably going to mention caesura. I'm probably going to mention enjambment. When it comes to tone, think about those moments of tonal change and why they're important. And when it comes to links, you can't fill anything in yet because you don't know the other poems, and therefore just leave that blank. When we think about theme, well, what's this poem trying to do? Go back and look at purpose, and that will help you. And in terms of context, you can write down some information about Alfred Lord Tennyson himself, and also about the Crimean War and the Light Brigade and who they were. But again, we don't want too much, maybe about 3 things to do with Alfred Lord Tennyson, 3 things to do with the Crimean War, that's enough. But the key thing is that you develop these revision notes in a way that you find useful. Okay, that's us.